"You don't need to see to know the truth, sir." The voice floated through the morning haze like a candle flickering in fog. Barely there, but steady. Marshall Grant turned his head, though his eyes, long lost to light, could only hold the memory of color. Beside him, Riley shifted. His black blindfold still gently nodded behind his ears, nose twitching toward the sound. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. But something in him stilled, as if he too recognized what was coming. Maple Hollow whispered its usual quiet, wind in the pine boughs, snow creaking beneath deer hooves, the distant murmur of a lake still dreaming under ice. Marshall's fingers curled tighter around the bench, not from fear, but from the strange weight of knowing he wasn't alone in his blindness anymore. He hadn't heard the girl approach, but her presence settled beside him like something known before knowing. "You've been given poison," she whispered, "but not the kind you can taste." Riley let out a slow, steady breath, and that was how it began. The moment a blind man and a blind dog saw more clearly than the world around them ever dared. Maple Hollow, Vermont, late winter, morning snowfall. The snow fell gently over Maple Hollow like sifted flour, dusting the frozen branches of the pines that lined the lake. It was the kind of morning where the cold didn't bite. It settled. Lake Maple Hollow lay still, its glassy surface veiled in mist. Not far from the shore stood a cedarwood cabin, dark against the white. The house belonged to a man who no longer saw the lake, but remembered its sound. Marshall Grant, 52. Once the sharp-eyed founder of Lumera Labs, had lost his vision in a lab explosion nearly 2 years prior. The blast took more than his sight. It took his sense of direction in the world. Tall, with squared shoulders that now slumped ever so slightly, and graying dark hair trimmed close to the scalp, Marshall bore the weathered dignity of someone who had once been invincible, and now had learned silence too well. Since the accident, he had lived alone at the lake house, save for Eva Monroe, his full-time nurse. Friends had faded, business meetings disappeared, the last reporter stopped calling a year ago. But Eva remained, efficient and gentle, like clockwork. Eva, 36, had a crisp composure about her. She was tall, willowy, with pale skin and sharp cheekbones that gave her face a statue's quiet edge. Her ash-blonde hair was always pulled into a low, perfect bun. In town, few knew her well. She didn't linger. She drove straight from the pharmacy to the lake house and spoke to no one unless required. Her eyes, when they landed on someone, seemed to measure, not greet. Inside the cabin that morning, the fire crackled low in the hearth. Marshall sat in his leather armchair, wearing a charcoal robe and listening to the snow ticking softly against the window. The sharp scent of pine logs hung in the air. Eva entered without a sound. Only the faint clink of the medicine tray gave her away. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," she said with her usual measured calm. He tilted his head toward her voice. "It's time already?" "It's important to stay on schedule," she replied. "Tilt your head back, please." He obeyed. She held the small bottle above his face, and with practiced hands, dropped 2 glistening beads into each eye. Marshall flinched slightly as the liquid burned. "Still stings," he muttered. "That's a good sign," she said. "Means the active compounds are engaging." He said nothing, only sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. Near the fireplace, a dark figure stirred. Riley had only arrived 3 days ago. A blind German shepherd with a glossy black and sable coat and a calm demeanor. His eyes were pale and clouded beneath the thick black cloth that wrapped gently around his head. Riley was just over 5 years old, rescued from an overcrowded shelter outside Rutland. He'd been found abandoned, tethered to a chain in the woods, unable to see and barely able to walk. Marshall hadn't planned to adopt him, but when Eva read the shelter's listing aloud last week, something about a dog who doesn't see but listens with his soul, he had said yes. Now, Riley lay curled near the fire, but at the sound of the dropper, his ears perked, and a low, uneasy groan escaped his throat. Marshall frowned. "He does that every time." "He's still adjusting," Eva replied quickly. "Unfamiliar scents, maybe the antiseptic." Riley lowered his head, but his body remained taut, alert in a way Marshall could feel rather than see. Later that afternoon, Eva brewed tea in the kitchen while Marshall sat in silence, fingers running over the braille bumps of a well-worn book. Riley remained close, never more than a few feet from him, his movements quiet but purposeful. Outside, the snow fell thicker now, cloaking the trees and muting the wind. Swing. 15 miles away, in downtown Maple Hollow, the bus from Montpelier pulled up beside the old post office. A woman in a slate blue wool coat stepped off, dragging a leather suitcase through the slush. Naomi Brooks had returned. Naomi, 51, had once been Marshall's closest confidant, an attorney with a keen sense of justice and a quicker wit. With short salt and pepper curls and eyes that missed nothing, she was a woman who had argued before judges and CEOs alike. Her gait was brisk, her voice warm but firm. Yet now, as she stood looking toward the silent lake in the distance, a shadow of worry crossed her face. She had sent letters, called, even tried to visit, but every attempt had been turned away, gently, politely, by Eva Monroe. "Mr. Grant is resting. He's not receiving visitors." The doctor advised quiet. Too much quiet, Naomi thought. She glanced down at the address scribbled in her notebook, then toward the snowy road that curved north toward the lake. "I'm not leaving without answers," she murmured. Snow had thickened over Maple Hollow like silence layered in cotton. 3 days had passed since Riley came into the cabin, and his presence had already altered the air. Though he moved with the hesitancy of the blind, the German shepherd's instincts were sharp, uncannily so. Beneath his black cloth blindfold, his ears caught every click, every inhale, every hesitation in Eva's voice. He didn't need eyes to see. That morning, Marshall sat at the kitchen table, fingers tracing the rim of his ceramic mug. Steam from black coffee curled into the air, but his mind was elsewhere. Across the room, Riley lay on the mat near the door, still but not asleep. Eva entered with her usual precision. Today she wore dark gray scrubs and a light pine green fleece, her blonde hair tied tighter than usual. She moved quietly, efficiently, setting down the morning tray. Her tone, as always, was warm but controlled. "Ready for your treatment?" she asked, unscrewing the cap from the small glass vial. Marshall leaned back, nodding, jaw tightening out of habit more than pain. Just as Eva approached, Riley stood. Not fast, deliberate. His paws thudded once on the wood floor, then he moved toward them. Low growl, steady. His snout lifted, nose twitching in the direction of the bottle. Then, with a sudden sharp motion, he nudged Eva's wrist. "Riley!" Eva hissed. The bottle tipped, caught midair by Marshall's quick hand, but one drop hit his robe, and he froze. He didn't speak at first. His hand went slowly to the damp patch, sniffing instinctively. There it was. Acrid, bitter, chemical. Something in the scent pierced through the fog of memory. Metal, heat, burning, exactly like the fumes that filled the lab on the day his vision was taken. His stomach dropped. Eva cleared her throat. "He's being difficult," she said, voice tight. New environment, new smells. Marshall didn't reply. He held the bottle for a moment longer, then set it gently on the table. "Leave it here. I'll do it myself later." She paused. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Eva said nothing else. She packed up the tray with her usual calm and left the room. Riley remained standing beside Marshall's chair, tense. Marshall reached down, letting his fingers glide over the dog's head. The black cloth over Riley's eyes was slightly damp from morning dew. The dog nudged his hand once, firm, insistent. "You know something," Marshall whispered. Log across town, Naomi Brooks sat in the back booth of an old cafe called the Hollow Cup. Warmth from the fireplace licked the soles of her boots as she sipped lukewarm tea and scanned her notebook. Her plan was clear. Find out who Eva Monroe really was and what she might be hiding. She had already gathered pharmacy receipts, local whispers, and financial records. Today she waited for a man named Caleb Monroe. The door chimed. He entered like someone expecting rain, hood up, hands deep in his pockets, eyes scanning every face. Caleb was in his late 30s, medium build, with a crooked posture and a nervous energy that clung to him like static. His dark blonde hair was thinning at the crown, and his skin had that pale, sleepless tone of a man who hadn't had peace in months. He sat across from Naomi, eyes darting to the corners of the room. "You said this wasn't about money," he began, voice low. It's not, Naomi said, not bothering with pleasantries. It's about your sister, Eva. Caleb tensed. She hasn't done anything. Then you won't mind answering a few questions. Naomi's gaze was steady. Like why she never mentioned you worked at Millis Pharma, or why your contract was terminated for falsifying safety data. Caleb blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. Naomi continued. It wasn't public, but I have friends in the state board. You doctored a formula. You pushed it through testing. His jaw clenched. They told me to adjust the numbers. Everyone does it. Naomi raised an eyebrow. And now your sister is administering a special compound to a blind man who's been cut off from friends, doctors, and media. Is that what everyone does? Caleb shook his head slowly. You don't know her. She's always had this thing since Mom died. A need to be indispensable. She can't stand being ordinary. Naomi's pen hovered over her notebook. So, you think she's trying to control him? I think, Caleb exhaled, she thinks she's saving him. Naomi leaned forward. Then help me stop her before she ruins him. Swing. That evening, Marshall sat on the porch wrapped in a thick wool coat. The bottle still sat untouched on the table inside. Riley lay by his feet, alert. Ava hadn't spoken much the rest of the day. She had brought him dinner, roast chicken and steamed greens, and disappeared quickly after. He didn't ask where she went. Marshall's hand went to his chest pocket. He pulled the vial of drops out and opened it again. The smell hadn't faded. He brought it close to Riley's nose. The dog growled low and turned his head away. Marshall tightened the cap. That was no coincidence. The wind sweeping across Maple Hollow that morning carried a bitter edge, carving icy fingers through the pine trees and across the lake's frozen surface. The house overlooking the shore stood silent and hunched under the weight of early March snow. Inside, Marshall Grant sat in the sunroom, his hands resting on the arms of a wooden chair, polished smooth by time and routine. The snow muffled the world outside, and only the soft wheeze of the fire kept time. Riley lay stretched out beside him, his black blindfold still in place, his ears twitching at every sound. He hadn't barked once since arriving, but Marshall could tell he was listening, watching in his own way. The decision had been made in the early hours of the morning. Marshall had felt it like the shift of a tide. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The scent on the medicine, the stifled atmosphere of the house, Eva's over-control, and Riley's unshakable reaction to it all. So, when Eva stepped out for her weekly grocery run, a rare moment when she left the cabin unattended, Marshall reached for the old rotary phone on the hallway wall. His fingers remembered its layout better than his mind did. He called Dr. Harris. Alan, he said, voice low but urgent. I need a blood panel. Quietly. You remember how to find the house. Dr. Alan Harris didn't ask questions. He had been Marshall's physician for years, pushed aside after the accident by Eva's private nursing schedule. But he still checked in once a month with a Christmas card or a quiet voicemail. He arrived before noon. A stocky man in his late 50s, Dr. Harris had a kind, square face and wore a wool coat too large for his frame. His salt-colored hair curled slightly above his ears, and his voice was a balm, gentle, never hurried. He carried a compact black bag under one arm as he stepped into the warm cabin, nodded once to Marshall, and said, "Let's keep this between us." 15 minutes later, the blood was drawn, labeled, sealed, and slipped back into Harris's bag. He left through the rear door before Eva returned. The next morning, Marshall waited and waited. No word from Dr. Harris. Eva prepared his breakfast, steel-cut oats, green tea, a single square of dark chocolate, and said nothing unusual. She asked if he wanted his morning drops. He said no. She didn't press. By the third morning, the silence grew louder than any snowstorm. Then something strange happened. Marshall was in the study, feeling along the edge of the fireplace mantel, when he heard a quiet crinkle from the corner of the room. Riley. The dog had been rifling through the bin near Eva's work desk. His snout emerged holding a folded sheet of paper, creased, smudged, and torn near the bottom. Marshall crouched slowly. Riley brought it to him, mouth careful not to tear the edges. Marshall unfolded it, his fingers gliding over the paper's texture, then brushing across embossed headers, numbers, and printed charts. He recognized the lab format even without sight. Then he felt the embossed text line by line. The printer ink left subtle heat press marks. He traced the bloodwork summary carefully, reading through touch and memory, and then he froze. 2 of the compound levels were dangerously high. Traces of neuroleptic agents meant to sedate, suppress. The kind of drugs not normally found in any prescription eye drop. He let the page fall into his lap. "She's poisoning me," he whispered. Riley sat beside him, as if in agreement. Marshall didn't speak again for a long time. That evening, he picked up the phone a second time. This time, he called Naomi Brooks. Naomi had stayed at a modest rental cabin on the edge of town, above a family-run bakery that smelled of cinnamon and apples every morning. The space was small, only 1 bedroom, 1 window, and a kitchenette. But it was enough. When the phone rang, she hadn't expected his voice. "I need your help," Marshall said, "and I need you to believe me." She didn't hesitate. The next morning, Naomi drove to the Maple Hollow County office. She didn't ask permission. She walked in wearing her long navy coat, hair pinned back, and her lawyer's ID badge in her pocket in case anyone asked too many questions. She found what she needed in less than an hour. Eva Monroe had opened a private account under a newly registered trust name, Maple Horizon Holdings. Naomi traced 2 wire transfers, both large, both recent. They came from Virexon Biotech, a company based in Delaware, known for attempting to buy out adaptive neural interface patents, Marshall's exact technology. Virexon had a reputation in the industry, quiet deals, silent acquisitions. And now, it seemed, a motive. Eva had accepted money from them, and Marshall had unknowingly trusted her with his life. That night, back in the cabin, Marshall sat by the fire with Riley's head resting on his foot. He turned the lab paper over and over in his hand, committing each ridge and mark to memory. In his pocket was a small voice recorder Naomi had sent him years ago. He hadn't used it since. Now, he clicked it on. "If something happens to me," he said into the quiet room, "let this be the start." Riley shifted closer. Marshall didn't need eyes to know the dog was watching, not through sight, but through something truer. Snowflakes whirled beneath the cold silver moon as Maple Hollow sunk deeper into winter. The lake, once silent and still, now cracked with ice along its edges, groaning faintly in the quiet. Inside the cedar cabin overlooking that lake, something else shifted, something harder to hear than the ice and more dangerous than the cold. Riley lay on his thick mat beside the fireplace, the soft fur on his shoulders rising with each breath. The black blindfold remained tied gently around his head, though his ears were sharper than any man's eyes. Earlier that day, Naomi had come with something new, small, discreet, and hidden beneath the dog's collar. The recorder had been designed to capture sound even in hushed tones, perfect for rooms where trust had turned to suspicion. It nestled just behind the collar clasp, wrapped in cloth and wired to a secondary battery. Naomi had clipped it in herself, fingers working quickly beneath Riley's thick sable fur. "This little guy's the only one she doesn't watch," Naomi whispered to Marshall. He nodded slowly, his hand resting on Riley's head. "Then let him be the one who finally sees." That night, Eva paced the kitchen while Marshall feigned sleep in his armchair. She moved differently now, nervous, abrupt, her steps sharper on the wood floor. The pressure of secrecy weighed heavier each day. And that night, for the first time in weeks, she made a call. Her phone call was short, whispered into the receiver, but Riley stood near, ears rotating slowly. The recording caught everything. "She's too close," Eva whispered. "Naomi's here." A pause. "I don't care. We have to finish it," she continued, voice cracking. "The blood test almost ruined it. He knows something. But the compound's working. Just a few more weeks and his mind won't question anymore. He'll be manageable." Silent. Another pause. "Don't come here," she warned. "The dog watches me." The name on the other end didn't have to be spoken. Caleb. Eva hung up shortly after. Riley returned quietly to Marshall's side. By morning, Marshall sat at the dining table, hands folded tightly as Naomi replayed the audio for him. Her laptop rested on the table, connected to a small speaker, and the cold voice of Eva filled the room with every syllable she thought no one would hear. Marshall didn't speak for a full minute after it ended. Then, for the first time since the explosion, he stood slowly and said, "I want my suit." Naomi looked up, surprised. "I haven't worn it in 2 years," he added. "But if I'm going to face them, my board, my name, my company, I won't do it in robes." 2 hours later, Marshall stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom. The charcoal gray suit fit slightly looser than before, but he still held his shoulders square. Naomi helped him knot the blue tie, then brushed invisible lint from his lapel. Riley stood beside him, freshly brushed and unusually alert. "I want him with me," Marshall said, reaching for Riley's leash. "He's earned it," Naomi replied. They left just past noon. The headquarters of Lumera Labs sat at the edge of Burlington, a sleek building of curved glass and brushed steel. It had once been Marshall's second home. He hadn't returned since the accident. Not since the day his vision vanished and the voices around him began treating him like a fading ghost. But this time, he walked in with purpose. Naomi entered first, flashing her badge to the receptionist. Riley trotted quietly at Marshall's side, blindfold still in place. Whispers followed them through the lobby. A security guard named Troy, mid-40s, square-jawed, and usually indifferent, stood at attention. "Mr. Grant?" he said softly. "I'm here to see the board," Marshall answered. Inside the boardroom, the 12 members sat like marble statues, some old allies, some unfamiliar replacements. At the far end of the long table sat Gerald Price, interim chairman, silver-haired and always impeccably dressed. A cautious man, Price had once mentored Marshall in the early years, but they hadn't spoken in over a year. Marshall placed a flash drive on the table. "This is a recording," he said, "taken from inside my home." He explained in slow, deliberate words how he had been drugged, monitored, silenced. Naomi handed out copies of the blood test. Then Marshall stood quietly as Ava's voice played through the speaker. Cold, calculated, damning. No one interrupted. When it ended, the room sat in stunned silence. Price finally leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "We'll reconvene within 48 hours. Marshall nodded. "I'm not here to beg, just to be heard." He turned and walked out, Riley matching his steps exactly. That same evening, down at the edge of town, Caleb Monroe tossed a duffel bag into the trunk of an old Toyota Corolla. He moved like someone who'd been running for a long time, shoulders hunched, neck down, checking over his shoulder, even when no one was there. Caleb was of medium build, with a forgettable face and thin, restless fingers. He had always been the kind of man who saw trouble before it saw him, except this time, it was already too late. As he climbed into the driver's seat, 2 officers stepped out from the shadows. "Caleb Monroe," one called. Caleb froze. Detective Mason Clark was a tall, weathered man with gray at his temples and the steady voice of someone who'd seen too many half-truths. He approached the car slowly, showing his badge. "You're under investigation for conspiracy to commit medical fraud, obstruction of health care, and financial collusion," he said evenly. Caleb didn't speak. Instead, he raised his hands and whispered, "She said it would all disappear." "You're right," Clark replied. "But not the way you hoped." The sun rose late over Maple Hollow, its light thin but gold, streaking through the pine trees and catching on the frozen surface of the lake. It was a morning after storm, a stillness that held something more than calm. It held change. Inside the cedar cabin that had once felt like a prison of silence, Marshall Grant stood near the porch window, a mug of black coffee in hand. His posture was different now, straighter, with his chin slightly lifted, no longer bowed under years of guilt and haze. Riley lay nearby, the black blindfold still gently tied across his eyes, his ears twitching as he tracked birds outside. The trial had ended 2 days ago. Eva Monroe had been arrested in the boardroom itself, handcuffed quietly by 2 plainclothes officers who entered without fanfare. She hadn't protested, only lowered her head. Her once carefully tied bun was loose, her expression unreadable. Caleb's confession, the bank transfers, the audio, the blood work. There had been no room left for denial. For Marshall, it wasn't about revenge. It was about regaining what had been taken, not just his company, his clarity. Today that clarity had turned into something new. He stepped onto the porch as snow crunched under a pair of approaching boots. Naomi Brooks appeared on the path, bundled in her navy peacoat, hair tousled by the wind, cheeks pink from cold. She held a thick envelope in one hand. "I brought the blueprints," she said, "and the legal paperwork." "Thank you," Marshall nodded. They entered the house, where Naomi laid the papers across the old kitchen table. Floor plans, zoning forms, non-profit status documents, all ready for filing. The house on the lake, once his sanctuary in exile, would now be something else entirely, a community center, a place where the disabled, the wounded, the lost could come to learn, to create, to heal. They would call it the Haven at Hollow Lake. Marshall traced the blueprints with his fingertips. "You sure about this, Naomi? It's going to take everything we have." Naomi smiled, not the tight, guarded smile she used with lawyers or boardrooms, but a real one, gentle and warm. "I've spent 30 years fighting for people to be seen. This question mark. This feels like the right kind of fight." She would serve as executive director. The staff would include therapists, artists, even a small animal-assisted therapy program. Riley, of course, would be the heart of it. The first day of renovations brought volunteers from across town. Kayla from the bakery arrived with her father, Joe, a retired carpenter with sun-leathered skin and arms like fence posts. Joe rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of old forests. "We're not here for money," he told Marshall simply. "We're here because it's time this place breathed again." Among the volunteers was also Sarah Linwood, a middle-aged teacher from the elementary school. She was tall and lean, with auburn hair tied back, in a loose braid. Years of working with children had made her voice both firm and kind. Her husband had lost his sight in a car accident 5 years prior, and she had a quiet understanding in her gaze when she met Marshall. "Healing doesn't always mean returning to who you were," she said. "Sometimes it means becoming someone stronger." Marshall nodded. "That's the goal." Riley, as always, moved among the crowd without fear. Though blind, he seemed to sense every shift in emotion, nudging anxious hands, curling beside those who sat apart. Children came to him first, drawn by his quiet patience. He never barked, never flinched. And in those moments, it became clear, this dog, who had once been discarded like something broken, was now the soul of the project. At the end of that first week, Naomi arranged a small gathering in the main room, still unfinished, wires hanging from beams, the smell of sawdust in the air. Marshall stood before the group, not as a man who once owned a tech empire, but as someone beginning again. "I lost my sight years ago," he said, "but I didn't lose it because of an explosion. I lost it because I stopped trusting the light inside people. And then, a blind dog saw what I could not, and a friend reminded me that silence isn't strength." He paused, reaching down to touch Riley's collar. "This center will be for those who've been silenced too long." Applause followed, not loud, but steady. The kind that meant more than noise. It meant belonging. That night, Marshall sat alone by the fireplace, fingers tracing the edge of a carved wooden plaque Naomi had commissioned. The words were simple, etched in cedar. "True vision lives not in the eyes, but in the heart." Riley rested at his feet, head tilted slightly, listening to the crackle of flame. Outside, the town of Maple Hollow glowed under the first real spring moon. And in the house by the lake, light no longer came through windows. It came from within. Sometimes the truest light comes not from the eyes, but from faith. Faith that God places unlikely miracles in our path, even when we cannot see them. Riley was blind, but he saw through deception. Marshall was broken, but he was restored through truth, love, and quiet courage. And Naomi, guided not by sight but by conviction, became the bridge between what was lost and what could be found. This story reminds us that God's miracles don't always arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they come gently, in the form of a loyal dog, a friend who doesn't give up, or a second chance to begin again. In our everyday lives, we all know someone who feels forgotten or unseen. But God sees them, and through us, He can reach them. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and type Amen to declare that you still believe in unseen miracles. Share this story with someone who needs light today. And don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and help us keep telling real stories that heal. May God bless you, and all who are walking through darkness, may they find their way back to light.